In the late 1930s, the world was a powder keg, and the United States was a reluctant spectator. Across the Atlantic, the clouds of fascism darkened Europe, while in the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy grew in both size and ambition. America, still reeling from the Great Depression, looked toward its coasts. The oceans had always been the nation's greatest moat, and the battleships of the U.S. Navy were the sentinels guarding the gates. The battleship era was one of romanticized power. There was a unique, terrifying beauty in a line of dreadnoughts steaming across the horizon. To the American public, these ships were symbols of stability and safety. They were built by the hands of workers in Brooklyn, Norfolk, and Philadelphia, men who poured their sweat into rivets and armor plate, believing these ships were invincible. However, technology was outpacing tradition. The rise of the airplane was beginning to cast a shadow over the big guns. While the admirals argued over the line of battle, the young pilots looked at the horizon with different ideas. This story is about that transition, the moment when the steel giants had to prove their worth or face extinction in a world that was rapidly changing. As 1941 dawned, the Pacific Fleet sat nestled in the volcanic embrace of Hawaii. The sailors lived a life of routine, polishing brass and practice loading massive shells. They were the tip of the spear, yet they lived in a state of uneasy peace. They did not know that the age of the battleship was about to be baptized in fire, beginning with a tragedy that would rewrite the course of human history. The morning of December 7, 1941, was a postcard of Hawaiian paradise. The USS Arizona sat at Battleship Row, her crew preparing for a standard Sunday. On deck, the band was warming up for the morning colors. Below decks, sailors were writing letters home or finishing breakfast. There was no radar alert, no warning, just the sudden, high-pitched whine of engines that didn't sound like American planes. When the first Kate torpedo bombers and Val dive bombers emerged from the clouds, the Arizona became the primary target. The Japanese pilots had practiced for months to sink the pride of the American fleet. The ship's anti-aircraft crews scrambled to their stations, but the surprise was too complete. The air was quickly filled with the smell of burning oil and the deafening roar of explosions. At 8:10 a.m., a modified 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb dropped from high altitude struck the Arizona near Turret 2. It sliced through the reinforced decks like a hot knife through wax. It didn't stop until it reached the forward powder magazine, the room where tons of explosive propellant for the 14-inch guns were stored. The resulting detonation was so massive it defied description. A pillar of fire shot 500 feet into the air, and the 33,000-ton ship was literally lifted out of the water before breaking in two. The blast killed 1,177 men instantly, including Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd and Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg. The shock wave was so powerful it extinguished fires on nearby ships. For those who survived on the stern, the world became a nightmare of black smoke and oil-slicked water. They fought to save their shipmates, but the Arizona was already a tomb. She sank to the bottom in minutes, her superstructure a mangled wreck of twisted steel. The heart of the Pacific Fleet had been torn out in a single, catastrophic moment. The mystery of Battleship X, USS South Dakota, BB-57. By late 1942, the American public was hungry for heroes. However, the Navy was obsessed with operational security. When a new battleship began making headlines for its bravery in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, the censors refused to name it. In newspapers across the country, she became a legend known only as Battleship X. This mysterious giant was the USS South Dakota. The South Dakota was a brawler. Shorter and more heavily armored than her predecessors, she was designed to take a hit and keep swinging. During the Santa Cruz engagement, she was tasked with protecting the carrier Hornet. The Japanese launched a relentless air assault, and the South Dakota found herself in the crosshairs of dozens of torpedo bombers. In the chaos, a 500-pound bomb struck Turret I. The explosion wounded many, including the ship's captain, but the South Dakota didn't flinch. Her gunners continued to fill the sky with steel, downing 26 enemy aircraft in a single day. The mystery ship was proving to be a nightmare for the Imperial Japanese Navy, which found her armor nearly impossible to pierce. However, her greatest test came shortly after, during the naval battle of Guadalcanal. In a confused night engagement, the South Dakota suffered a massive electrical failure. She was blinded in the middle of a war zone surrounded by enemy ships. She took 42 hits from Japanese cruisers and battleships, her superstructure becoming a jagged ruin of fire and shrapnel. Despite the devastating damage, the South Dakota stayed afloat. Her thick armor belt protected her vitals, and her damage control teams worked miracles in the dark, suffocating heat of the ship's interior. The fact that she survived a night of being a stationary target for an entire Japanese fleet earned her a reputation for being unsinkable in the eyes of her crew. When Battleship X finally returned to the U.S. for repairs and her true identity was revealed, she was greeted as a national icon. The South Dakota represented the rugged, blue-collar toughness of the American Midwest. She was a reminder that even when the lights go out and you're surrounded, you keep fighting until the job is done. The Showboat's Shield, USS North Carolina, BB-55. The loss of the Arizona forced the U.S. Navy to evolve. By 1942, the new fast battleships were entering the fray. Leading the charge was the USS North Carolina. She was a marvel of modern engineering, designed to be fast enough to keep up with aircraft carriers while carrying a lethal battery of 9 16-inch guns. Because she spent so much time in New York Harbor being admired before the war, the media dubbed her the Showboat. In August 1942, the Showboat went to work in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. The strategic landscape had changed. The aircraft carrier was now the primary weapon, but carriers were fragile. They needed a guardian, a ship that could put up a literal wall of lead between them and the Japanese kamikazes and dive bombers. The North Carolina was that guardian. During the height of the battle, Japanese aircraft swarmed the carrier Enterprise. The North Carolina moved into a protective screen, her crew manning dozens of 5-inch and 40mm anti-aircraft guns. The sky became an impenetrable grid of exploding flak and tracer fire. For the first time, the Japanese pilots realized that attacking an American task force was like flying into a meat grinder. The intensity of the North Carolina's fire was so great that the crew of the Enterprise actually signaled to ask if the battleship was on fire. The smoke from her guns was so thick it completely obscured the ship. She wasn't burning, though. She was breathing fire. She shot down between 7 and 14 planes in a single engagement, a record for a battleship at the time. This battle redefined the battleship's purpose. No longer were they just ship killers, they were the ultimate anti-aircraft platforms. The North Carolina proved that a battleship's presence could ensure the survival of the carriers, which were the only way to strike back at the Japanese mainland. The Showboat had become a warrior. The North Carolina survived the war with 15 battle stars, having participated in every major naval offensive in the Pacific. She became a blueprint for the fast battleship doctrine, proving that speed and defensive firepower were just as important as the size of the main guns. She paved the way for the total air superiority America would eventually achieve. The Duel in the Dark, USS Washington, BB-56. While the South Dakota was taking a beating at Guadalcanal, her sister ship, the USS Washington, was waiting in the shadows. Command of the Washington fell to Rear Admiral Willis Ching Lee, a man who loved two things, mathematics and marksmanship. Lee was one of the first commanders to truly understand the power of a new technology, radar. On the night of November 14, 1942, the Washington slipped through the treacherous waters of Iron Bottom Sound. The Japanese battleship Kirishima was busy hammering the crippled South Dakota, unaware that a silent predator was closing in. While the Japanese relied on superior night vision and flares, Lee was using the Washington's radar to calculate a solution in the pitch black. At 8,000 yards, a distance where a battleship's 16-inch guns are terrifyingly accurate, Lee gave the order to fire. The Washington unleashed a full broadside. The night sky vanished, replaced by a blinding flash of orange light. The sound was like a mountain collapsing. The shells, each weighing as much as a car, traveled at supersonic speeds toward their target. The Kirishima never stood a chance. In 7 minutes, the Washington landed at least 20 hits with her main battery and scores more with her 5-inch guns. The Japanese battleship was transformed into a floating furnace. Her steering was shattered, her turrets were blown off, and she began a slow terminal roll into the depths of the Pacific. This was a landmark moment in naval history. It was one of only 2 battleship versus battleship duels in the entire Pacific War. The Washington had used American technological superiority to defeat a veteran Japanese crew in their preferred environment, a night fight. Admiral Lee's radar-directed victory saved the Marines on Guadalcanal from a shore bombardment that likely would have wiped them out. The Washington emerged from the battle without a single scratch from enemy fire. She had moved like a ghost and struck like a thunderbolt. Her success proved that the big gun era still had a place in modern war, provided those guns were guided by the best technology America could produce.
The Old Guard's Revenge, USS Pennsylvania, BB-38. As the war turned toward 1944, the U.S. Navy prepared for the largest naval engagement in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. In the middle of this massive conflict was the USS Pennsylvania. For the Pennsy, this wasn't just a strategic mission, it was personal. She had been in dry dock at Pearl Harbor on the day of the attack, and she had spent the war waiting for a chance to look the Japanese fleet in the eye. The opportunity came at Surigao Strait. A Japanese task force was attempting to sneak through the strait at night to attack the American landing beaches. Waiting for them was a line of 6 American battleships, 5 of which were survivors of Pearl Harbor. They formed a horizontal line across the strait, a classic tactical maneuver known as crossing the T. As the Japanese column approached, the Pennsylvania and her sisters opened up. It was a symphony of vengeance. The American ships used their radar to track the Japanese in the dark, and when they opened fire, the concentrated weight of their shells was so immense that the Japanese lead ship, the Yamashiro, was overwhelmed by hundreds of hits in a matter of minutes. The Pennsylvania fired with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. For the men on board, many of whom had seen the smoke rising over Oahu 3 years earlier, each shell was a message. The Japanese fleet was decimated. It was the last time in history that battleships would ever fight each other in a line of battle. The Old Guard had closed the book on naval warfare with a crushing victory. The Pennsylvania spent the rest of the war as a fire support ship. Her massive guns were used to soften up island defenses for the Marines. She became known as the Old Falling Apart by some, but her reliability was legendary. She had traveled from the depths of a surprise attack to the height of naval dominance. The battle at Surigao Strait proved that while the carrier was the new king, the battleship was the undisputed master of the close-range brawl. The Pennsylvania had survived the first day of the war to ensure she was there for its final acts, personifying the resilience of a nation that refused to stay down. The flagship of fire, USS New Jersey, BB-62. In 1944 and 1945, the war moved to the Japanese doorstep. The flagship for this final push was the USS New Jersey, the Big J. She was an Iowa-class battleship, the pinnacle of the breed. Longer than 3 football fields and capable of speeds over 30 knots, she was the fastest battleship ever built. She was the personal flagship of Admiral William Bull Halsey, the most aggressive commander in the fleet. The New Jersey was a platform of pure power. During the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, she sat miles offshore, her 16-inch guns providing a continuous umbrella of fire. These shells could travel 24 miles and were used to collapse caves, destroy bunkers, and clear entire hillsides of enemy resistance. To the Marines on the ground, the sound of the New Jersey's shells was the sound of freedom. Life on the New Jersey was a study in American industrial might. She carried a crew of nearly 2,700 men. Inside her steel skin were bakeries, print shops, a hospital, and even an ice cream machine, a luxury that was a massive morale booster for sailors in the sweltering Pacific. She was a floating piece of America, projecting the comforts and the power of home into the enemy's backyard. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the New Jersey led the hunt for the Japanese carriers. Halsey wanted to use her speed to catch the enemy and finish them with the big guns. While the carriers ultimately did the heavy lifting, the New Jersey was the big stick that Halsey kept ready to smash anything that got too close. The New Jersey also faced the terrifying new threat of the kamikaze, suicide pilots. Her decks were bristling with nearly 150 anti-aircraft guns. Watching the New Jersey defend herself was like watching a volcano erupt. The amount of fire she could put into the air was so dense that it was statistically unlikely for a plane to make it through. She ended the war as one of the most decorated ships in U.S. history. The New Jersey showed that the battleship had evolved into a multi-role weapon, a flagship, an anti-aircraft platform, and a mobile artillery battery. She was the Black Dragon, a ship that the Japanese feared and American sailors adored. The Surrender Plank, USS Missouri, BB-63. The long, bloody road that began in the fire of the Arizona ended on the teak deck of the USS Missouri, the Mighty Mo. By August 1945, the Japanese had agreed to an unconditional surrender. President Harry Truman, a native of Missouri, chose the ship named after his home state to host the final ceremony. It was a symbolic choice. The battleship would witness the end of the conflict it had been built to win. On September 2, 1945, the Missouri sat anchored in Tokyo Bay. The ship was crowded with high-ranking officers from all the Allied nations, as well as hundreds of sailors who climbed into the rigging and onto the gun turrets to get a view. On the deck, a simple mess table was set up with the surrender documents. General Douglas MacArthur, his hands shaking slightly with the weight of the moment, addressed the world. He spoke of a better world to emerge from the blood and carnage of the past. Beside him stood Admiral Chester Nimitz and the British, Chinese, and Soviet representatives. The Japanese delegation, dressed in formal top hats and tails, signed the documents under the shadow of the Missouri's massive 16-inch guns. The choice of the Missouri was a final display of American power. As the signatures were dried, a massive flyover of 400 B-29 superfortresses and 1,500 carrier planes roared over the bay. The message was clear. The war was over, and the United States was now the preeminent power on Earth. The Missouri was the stage upon which the American century officially began. For the sailors on the Missouri, the ceremony was a moment of profound relief. They were no longer targets, they were witnesses to history. The ship that had been designed for destruction had become a sanctuary for peace. The Mighty Mo had fulfilled the ultimate purpose of any weapon, to bring about the day when it is no longer needed. After the ceremony, the Missouri didn't just fade away. She went on to serve in Korea, the Cold War, and even the Gulf War in 1991. But her legacy was forever forged in that one morning in Tokyo Bay. She was the bookend to the Arizona, where one ship signaled the start of a tragedy, the other signaled the start of a new, hopeful era.
Today, the era of the battleship is over. The steel behemoths have been replaced by the surgical precision of missiles and the stealth of nuclear submarines. Most of the great ships were sold for scrap, their steel melted down to build the cars and skyscrapers of a peaceful America. But for a few, a different fate was reserved.
Ships like the North Carolina, New Jersey, and Missouri now serve as museum ships. They sit in quiet harbors, their guns silent, and their decks trodden by tourists rather than sailors. They are classrooms of history, where children look up at the 16-inch barrels and try to imagine the roar of a broadside. They are monuments to the millions of Americans who served and the industrial genius that made victory possible. The legacy of the U.S. battleship in World War II is one of adaptation. They were born in an age of giants, nearly destroyed by a new age of flight, and yet they found a way to remain indispensable. They protected the carriers, they liberated the islands, and they stood as the final platform for peace. As the sun sets over the Arizona Memorial in Pearl Harbor and glints off the bow of the Missouri in the same harbor, the story comes full circle. One ship represents the cost of war, and the other the triumph of peace. Together, they stand as the silent sentinels of the American spirit, built of steel, tested by fire, and enduring through time.